I was backpacking in Washington State exploring the national parks. I was about 20 yards from the nearest road, and for the first 2 days I didn't see anyone. It was early fall and the weather was colder than most people would like, but I had all the gear I needed. One morning I got up, made a quick pot of coffee on my pocket stove, and headed to the next campsite, which was about 20 feet away. In the mountains, that meant a long walk. 4 hours later, I heard footsteps on the trail ahead of me. When I looked up, I saw a man coming in the opposite direction. I didn't expect to see anyone, but I smiled and waved. I noticed something very strange. He had no backpack, no water bottle, nothing. He was just wearing a long-sleeved t-shirt and old pants. I thought it was odd, but I kept walking. I figured he might have a campsite nearby and was just wandering around. I eventually reached my campsite. It was a small place, not as nice as I had hoped, and without a decent view since it was surrounded by trees. I was exhausted and set up my tent, getting ready to relax and watch the sunset. As I sat there, I heard shuffling footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw the same man. He still didn't have a backpack or anything, and I was even more confused. He was heading in the opposite direction when I saw him before, so to be here, he must have changed direction right after he passed me. He walked to the other side of the camp and sat on the ground, no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing. He just stood there staring into the forest. He was about 5 meters away from me, and as the sun was setting, I started to feel unsafe. Who was this guy and what was he doing here with no shelter, food, or water? It was 30 minutes later and he hadn't moved. I decided I couldn't stay there. I started to take down my tent and pack. That's when the man looked at me and he didn't look away. Every time I looked at him, he was staring at me. When I finished packing my things, I saw him stand up out of the corner of my eye. I started walking as fast as I could, hearing his footsteps right behind me. I clutched my small knife in my hands, not knowing what was going to happen. I looked back a few times, seeing him still following me but starting to move away. I decided to take a chance and leave the trail, heading into the woods. It was now dark and I hoped he wouldn't see me. I hid behind a tree and waited. About 30 seconds later, I heard his footsteps on the trail, but just as he was about to pass, he stopped. I watched him in the dark, looking around as if he knew I was no longer on the trail. Then he started yelling, trying to sound friendly, which only made it more frightening. After about 2 minutes, he stopped yelling and instead of going back to camp, he walked into the woods on the other side of the trail. I stood there, silent, for over an hour before I finally got up and continued. I forced my body to keep going and jumped to the next campsite to be safe. When I got back to town, I went to the police station and reported it. They never contacted me again. I don't know if the man was living there, trying to rob or kidnap someone, or maybe both, but I was lucky to have escaped when I did. That was a little over 2 years ago. Hi, my name is Jake. Before this story, I had never been camping before, but I had always wanted to try it. So I decided the best way to learn was to just go out and do it. I picked a campsite about 2 hours away from my hometown. It seemed perfect for my first time. It wouldn't be crowded, but it wouldn't be deserted either. I got to the campsite around noon and walked for a few more hours until I reached the site. There were a few park benches and grills scattered around. I noticed that a few small trails led to other campsites where other people had already set up their tents. I picked one of these little spots, set my gear down, and spent the next hour setting up my tent and checking to make sure everything was in order. Meanwhile, a few people were hanging out in the central area, using their grills and chatting. I'm not much of a social person, so I kept to myself. But about half an hour later, a guy came up to me and invited me to join his group. He seemed nice, so I went with him. I met some of the other people who were camping. Everyone was nice and I hung out with them for another hour. Then people started to disperse and I went back to my tent. It was about 7 p.m. and the sun was almost setting. That's when TJ, the guy who had invited me earlier, came back to my tent. He was about my age, mid-20s or early 30s. He asked if I had been to this area before. When I said no, he asked me if I knew of a lake nearby. I didn't know anything about it, so he started telling me about this hidden lake that no one knew about and how cool it was. He said he was going there and invited me to come along. It seemed like a good idea and I was intrigued. I dropped my stuff in the tent and went with him. He said it was a 10-minute walk through the woods, so I figured we had plenty of time before it got dark. We followed a very narrow trail through the trees. It wasn't a marked trail, but it looked like someone had been there a few times. But 10 minutes passed and there was still no lake. TJ, who had been chatty before, became strangely quiet. Now he was only giving short answers and staring at the setting sun. Something inside me started telling me that this wasn't right. It seemed like he was waiting for the sun to set. After about 20 minutes of walking, I started to pull away from him a little. I wasn't so confident about this adventure anymore, and my body started to feel alert, as if it knew something was wrong. The sunlight barely made it through the trees and the forest was very quiet. When I thought I had a chance, I turned and tried to run back the way we came. TJ noticed right away and shouted my name, trying to sound friendly, but soon after his tone changed to a frustrated yell, and I heard him running after me. After a minute of chasing, I heard his footsteps slow down, but soon after a loud metallic sound rang out behind me. I quickly looked back and saw a knife hitting a tree a few feet away from me. I think that was his last attempt to stop me. After that, I lost track of him. I ran back to the campsite and told the other people what had happened. Someone called the police on me. TJ or whoever he was never showed up again. In fact, everyone said he was already at the campsite when they got there, and after a little searching they found out he didn't even have a tent. He probably picked me because he knew I was alone and didn't have much camping experience. Luckily, I didn't have to find out what he really wanted to do that night, because if I had, I might not be here to tell this story. Last year I was spending a few weeks in Montana with my truck and a trailer attached to the back. This trailer was like my mobile home, so I usually parked at campgrounds or in public areas where it was allowed. On one of my last days of traveling, my truck started acting up and it took me almost the entire day to fix it. By the time I was finally done, the sun was setting and I hadn't made much progress on the road. I grabbed a coffee at a gas station and decided to drive another 2 hours before finding a place to spend the night. I used an app to find a nearby campground and found one that was a little off the road, in a very quiet area. The entrance was a dirt road that led about a quarter mile into the forest, ending in a grassy open space surrounded by trees. There was no one else there, so I parked my truck facing the exit in case I needed to leave quickly. It was around 11 p.m. by then and I was ready for bed. As I lay down, I noticed a light shining through the curtains of the trailer. I peeked out the window and saw another vehicle coming down the dirt road toward me. It was an old, rusty pickup truck, and its headlights were pointed directly at my trailer. I thought it might be other people looking for a place to camp, but instead of turning around or parking somewhere else, they just stopped there, blocking the exit. Something about this made me uneasy. As I was thinking about what to do, I saw the door of their truck open. The headlights went out and 2 men got out. It was dark, but I could make out that they were holding something in their hands that looked like heavy tools. My heart raced. The men started approaching my trailer, trying to walk silently. One of them said, "Hey, can you help us? We need some directions. Can you open the door?" His voice sounded strange, maybe he was drunk. I looked out the window again and saw that one of them was holding something like a crowbar or a sledgehammer. They started to fumble with the door of my trailer, trying to pry it open. I was terrified and pushed the door with my legs to keep it closed. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the forest. A gunshot. The 2 men froze for a second and then ran back to their truck. In less than half a minute, they started the engine and disappeared down the dirt road. I knew this was my chance to get out of there. I gathered my courage, quickly got out of the trailer and got into my truck. I started the engine and drove straight back to the main road. After an hour of driving, I found a busy truck stop and stopped there to rest. To this day, I don't know who fired that shot in the forest. It could have been a hunter or another camper who noticed I was in danger and wanted to help me. Whoever it was, I am very grateful because they probably saved me from a very dangerous situation. It was a scary experience, but I was relieved that everything turned out well.